Thank you. Thank you, Council. Apologies for the slight delay.
Thank you, Chair. I can confirm that the documents that have been referred to and the documents shown on the screen will be tendered later in the week as a bundle in respect of that should gather in all of the documents that are referred to this week. We will propose to do it as a tender at the end of the week. As I indicated...
No, Council, could I just make people aware that the ABC is in the room doing some filming for a very short time. So just people aware. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. As I indicated before the lunch break, I propose to ask the witnesses some questions now about the document which is referred to as the Batman Treaty. You're all familiar with the Batman Treaty?
Yes.
You might be aware that in January 1827, John Batman and Joseph Gellibrand applied for a grant of land at Port Phillip, which of course at that time was part of the colony of New South Wales, and that application was refused. From your view and taking into account the things that you've said earlier today, does that tell us anything about the views or intentions of the colonial government in New South Wales, in Port Jackson, regarding settlement in Victoria, the fact that they were refused their lease or grant?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, government in Sydney was trying to confine settlement to control it, and they didn't want anything happening on the southern coast of Australia. And so that's the reason why I think Batman's attempt to get land was refused in 1827.
The application for a grant of land by Batman and Gellibrand at the time indicates that at least they thought the land around Port Phillip was valuable. That's a fair assumption. Would you agree? And it's the type of lands that is similar in type to the land that Sir Thomas Mitchell had observed when he gave the southern part of Australia the name Australia Felix. Yes?
Correct.
Now, is it correct to your understanding that that in 1832, at least, there were Tasmanian pastoralists who already had granted lands in the Tasmanian settlements who were looking to move to or open up other operations in Victoria by way of a settlement there? You're nodding your head.
Yes, there was a number of businessmen and farmers in Tasmania who had their eye on the south coast of Victoria, and they got together eventually in June 1835 and established something called the Port Phillip Association with the intention of coming to Port Phillip and finding good farming country.
And was the association simply a group of farmers, or did they do more than that?
They were businessmen, they were colonists. John Batman, whose name ends up on the treaty, was also an entrepreneur, a grazier, an explorer. He also was involved in the violence that had happened in Tasmania. He led an attack on Palawa people. His party had killed an estimated 15 people and captured some, including keeping a 2-year-old boy.
So it appears that not only by 1835 that not only were the Henty brothers trying to push into the land north of Portland, but also there was another group of pastoralists who were trying to acquire land in the Port Phillip area.
That's correct.
And the resistance, as Professor Broome has told us, is that the colonial government were concerned at their ability to control these areas once they opened them up. That's understood to be the case, and so it was entirely to acquire resources or pastoral land that they were seeking to open up. There wasn't any greater purpose or objective.
That's the reason behind it.
Was it entirely an economic commercial venture. And now, the advocates of this opening up of country, did any of you observe that they had particular regard for the Aboriginal owners and occupiers of the land?
I think they made the case that they wanted, I think that they understood that the world was watching what was happening in Tasmania, and that the colonial government was very concerned about the violence happening there. And I think that they were clever enough to realise that they needed to at least appear that way. I wouldn't know whether that was actually what was in their minds, and I suspect that it wasn't, but they certainly made noises about treating with Aboriginal people with being more humanitarian about the way in which country was taken.
Are you aware of any inquiry being conducted in the UK Parliament about this time in relation to Aboriginal peoples in the British Empire?
Yes, that exactly what you just said was happening. A select committee in London was investigating what was happening in many of Britain's colonies, really coming from the perspective that there was too much violence, and there was a big humanitarian push and a movement to rein in what was happening in British colonies. And they were taking evidence from what was happening in Australia as well as in many other places in the world.
Thank you. I'll come back to the UK Parliament Select Committee report in a moment, but is it the case that Batman represented the Port Phillip Association to travel to the Bellarine Peninsula?
Yes, that's correct.
What year was that, do you think?
I believe that was 1835. In May, they sailed across the Bass Strait and landed in Indented Head on the Bellarine Peninsula.
Is there anything we know about what Batman had intended to do?
I'm not sure if we know about his intentions, but we do know what he did when he got there.
And what did he do when he got there?
They travelled around the area around Port Phillip Bay, and then during that time they met with people from the Kulin Nations a number of times, and when they did so, they gave them gifts of things like blankets, handkerchiefs, sugar and apples and other items, and also received gifts in exchange, things like baskets and spears.
And what were those gifts and items being exchanged for?
Well, at that point, I'm not sure what their intentions were, but I'm guessing it was in order to create some kind of exchange. Perhaps also the Kulin people were bringing Batman and his party into their own ways of doing things.
So if I suggest to you that on the 6th of June, Batman met with some Kulin elders and signed two deeds on the banks of the Yarra River.
Yes, it's disputed where it took place, but that's correct, yeah.
And is it known whether Batman wrote those agreements on the spot or he brought them with him?
I'm not sure. Richard, do you know that one?
I think that they were brought with him. So the intention was to purchase land and therefore to make it seem like a legal transaction in the eyes of the British, and particularly in the eyes of the evangelicals, as Kate Ellinghouse has said. They were playing to the evangelical lobby to show that they were good colonists. They were willing to purchase land, and I think that the Select Committee had said that that Aboriginal people were traditional owners of land.
And so, are you aware of the size of the land that was purported to have been acquired through those deeds?
Well, it was supposed to stretch from Melbourne to Geelong.
I suggest to you that one of the deeds related to 500,000 acres of Melbourne. Does that ring a bell?
Yes, it does.
And the other one, the Geelong deed, related to over 100,000 acres of land around Geelong in Indented Head. That
That's correct.
recognise those figures. So the fact that he came with the, or you recall that he came with the deeds indicates that he came there with the intention of entering those agreements. The fact that he entered agreements with the Aboriginal people of those places, the Kulin elders, is some form of recognition of ownership of those lands.
Yes, correct. Yep.
The value or the consideration paid for those lands amounts to a very small amount of blankets and axes and a number of other consumable items. It doesn't appear that the value exists in the items that were said to be traded for the title to those lands. So if I can put it that way, do you agree?
Well, Aboriginal people didn't have monetary value on things, so I don't think you can make that direct connection. But certainly, in our views, it doesn't seem a particularly good bargain.
The other issue that might arise from that is whether in a society that doesn't believe in their capacity to alienate lands in any event, what Batman and the deed might have indicated he was acquiring, it may not have been what the same thing that the Kulin elders were intending to give. Would you agree with that?
There's some people believe that what the Kulin elders were doing was some kind of Tanderum ceremony, which allowed Batman and his party passage across the land rather than giving the land away. Did you want to say something?
It's kind of like along the same. That's our cultural way. You welcome people onto your land, and then you do an exchange. So what was being exchanged there were different, ideologies and kind of thoughts happening there. And I'm not sure culturally what was happening there could have happened by law, in Aboriginal law.
Aboriginal. Thank you. Do you have any information on which you can offer any thoughts as to what Batman was, why Batman thought it might be important to sign a treaty with the Kulin Nation?
I think he was trying to play a game to force the colonial government into opening up that land. I think that he was pulling on the kind of international custom of treaties that he would have known about that took place in other places like New Zealand and United States of America to create a legal document to force the government's hand.
I think adding to that was he was very well aware that the government in Britain at the time was run by an evangelical lobby group that had been important in the ending of slavery in the British Empire. So they were very sympathetic to the rights of Indigenous peoples. And so by posturing as a land agreement, then he was hoping that might even stick and he might be able to keep this land.
So, as a result of the entry into that agreement, what did the New South Wales colonial, the governor do?
So they actually thought about it for a few months and discussed it with the colonial government in the UK, but eventually Governor Richard Bourke declared the treaty null and void in August 1835. He declared that the settlement that Batman had undertaken on the lands that will become Victoria was illegal. He called the men trespassers, and they said that they should be dealt with as if they were intruders on vacant lands of the Crown.
And that declaration by the Governor Bourke in 1835, did it say anything with respect to the lands in the colony, the whole of the colony outside of the settled areas?
So basically, they treated the lands outside the settled area as part of New South Wales. It upheld the doctrine of terra nullius in saying that Aboriginal people had no ownership over those lands.
The longer term consequence of that declaration for Aboriginal people all over the Eastern Australia, but particularly in Victoria, was what? Can you say?
I guess it was a reaffirmation of the Crown's claim over the whole of the land, and that Aboriginal people had no rights to land. And I mean, I think it's important to note that despite the nefarious objectives of the Port Phillip Association, they are still to this day the only group offering land to Aboriginal, offering a treaty to Aboriginal people. And actually, this was quite valued at times by Aboriginal people. I remember Sir Doug Nicholls in the 1940s, they held annual commemorations of the Batman Treaty and saying that we want this honoured. So it's got this ironic twist to it.
If it had been honoured, then it would have acknowledged that Aboriginal people had the right to dispose of the land, and that thus that they had ownership of the land.
Do you have, as historians, any difficulty with the Burke Proclamation of ownership of the whole of the Eastern Australia, or the Australia as it then was, by way of proclamation?
Well, it was a big claim, wasn't it? Because a lot of the land was still unoccupied at that time. But I suppose it was in the logic of Cook's Act of Possession in 1770, which had claimed the whole of the East Coast. So it was true to that earlier declaration.
Now, I just want to ask you some questions about what might be referred to as colonist or settler and First Nations relationships. Professor Broom, you, in your book, Aboriginal Victorians, you devote some of, I think, chapter 4 to this particular study in terms of the nuanced relationships that existed, are known to exist from the records. Are you able to just expand on that for the commissioners, please?
Well, I think chapter 4 from my memory was talking about how pastoralists and squatters interacted with Aboriginal people that they found on the pastoral runs that they'd established. And there's a great mixture of relations, as we would expect in all human interactions. Aboriginal people often showed them bits of country, helped them establish their stations by cutting bark, helping them get sheep across rivers, etc., and then performed work for pastoralists on the station in exchange for tea and tobacco, and perhaps also some mutton and sheep. So there were, and of course the squatters wanted to create good relations at first because they were isolated themselves. Pastoral runs, you were 5 or 10 miles from your nearest neighbour. You might have 2 or 3 workers. So there were small groups of men trying to occupy large amounts of country that wasn't theirs. And of course, as we might discuss later, they had particular views of Aboriginal people that created their fear. Sometimes there was good relations when there were families and when there were children present. There were quite human interactions going. I remember in one instance, as a squatter shaved himself in the open, and Aboriginal men were quite intrigued, and he shaved one of them. So there were these sorts of human interactions going on. But of course, some others, especially as the frontier developed and the struggle over land between two groups, who both thought they had absolute rights to the land. The squatters thought he was there because they had a licence from the government. Aboriginal people, it was theirs through perpetuity. Then tensions started to arise, and some men were harder than the others in the way they interacted. There's always a spectrum of people willing, some not willing to enact violence, and other people willing to do so to defend what they thought was theirs. And of course, at this time, I think until about sometime in the 1820s, to take a sheep was a capital offence in England. So this is the framework. They were defending property. They thought they had the right to be there. And on the other side, Aboriginal people were defending the land that was their birthright in that sense.
Thank you. Now, in the period following the Batman Treaty and the Burke Declaration, if I can use that shorthand, there was an opening up of the Port Phillip settlement and Portland as well. That's correct. And in Chapter 5 of your book, which you titled "Dangerous Frontiers," you write of trouble that occurred in Geelong in 1836, the Ovens and Goulburn River in 1838, the Western Districts in 1839, the Gippsland area in 1840, and the Murray Valley and the Wimmera Mallee from 1842. And if we were to map those places, we would see that's the frontier of the settlement opening up, and where the conflict is occurring with the Aboriginal owners of the land. Is that correct?
It is correct, and it was probably the swiftest expansion within the British Empire of any occupation of land, because of the nature of the countryside that had been created by fire stick farming. It was perfect sheep country, and the expansion, particularly in central Victoria, was rapid. The Mallee and the Gippsland took longer, of course. But central Victoria probably was under sheep within 5 to 7 years of first settlement.
And you might have heard the chair's opening comments about from Kerr to the effect that never have a body of men become rich so quickly as those who took up land in Victoria. And that's the same process that you're speaking of in terms of the taking up of land.
Yes, there were ups and downs. There was a depression in 1842-43 where sheep were worth nothing and were boiled down for soap. But generally, money was to be made in pastoral work in the 1830, 1840s period.
I might at this point, Commissioners, ask Dr. Pascoe if he might deliver his presentation in relation to the massacres and the work of the University of Newcastle and the University of La Trobe University in relation to the massacre matter. If we can see operator document 4, which is a PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, will I have control of that, or how does that work? Go on to the next slide and so on.
Yes, if you can just ask the operators to move it to the next slide.
Okay. That's not it.
Document 4. Document 5, sorry. Document 5. Apologies. This is your presentation, which has been prepared by you, Dr. Pascoe.
Yes, that's right.
and it's been prepared from the study and research that you've done, particularly with Dr. Lyndall Ryan.
And yep.
And it has resulted in a fairly public massacre map. It's available online.
That's right.
If we could go to the next slide. Not the next document, the next slide in this PowerPoint, please. Dr. Pascoe, the page that's showing at the moment is your acknowledgements. You wish to make them orally?
Yeah, we have already been through the acknowledgements at the beginning, so I just wanted to acknowledge Wurundjeri, Woi Wurrung, and the Kulin Nation, whose lands and waters we're on today. Most of this work was done in Awabakal and Warramai country, and I grew up in Yoorrook country with some, and my great grandmother's Kabi Kabi, probably.
Please.
Okay, so firstly, a warning. So I'm going to talk about extreme cases of historical violence, but I will try to avoid any graphic details. And that's why we're here. So I'll just be very straightforward about what we're discussing. So firstly, a bit of background about the project. It is a project led by Professor Lyndall Ryan, starting in 2014 with a ARC grant. It's been a collaborative work of many historians and other workers such as myself. And more recently, it's been a volunteer effort to try and finish the work, and we do hope to be concluding the project in the coming months.
Slide, please.
Okay, and again, we can probably move on fairly quickly here because, yep. Okay, so yes, the project has involved consultation and collaboration in various forms. That includes Professor Ryan's lifetime of experience and her contacts, sessions held at Wallatuka at the University of Newcastle, meetings with IATSIS, Indigenous advisors and Indigenous staff, visits to community, speaking at conferences, ordinary conversations with people, and through the online feedback form that's available on the website. Yes, okay, so this is the online map of massacres across the whole of the country. The project was to create a database and map of known massacres of 6 or more people across the whole of Australia, starting with the first one in Hawkesbury in 1794 and the last one, ending with the last one at Coniston in 1928. So we only have on this map massacres for which there is documented evidence, but it does include oral histories of Indigenous people, but only where they've appeared in print. Considering the code of silence around massacres, it's reasonable to think that there are many more massacres occurred than this, and certainly many more killings of less than 6 people on the frontier. These locations shouldn't be regarded as precise or exact for a few reasons. One of them is that historical records are often pretty vague about where they occurred. They might say it was 3 miles ride north of the river or something like that. And another reason is that massacres aren't, well, sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't confined to a very specific spot. People might be camped in a very spread out manner, and there might be a pursuit involved from say, the campsite to the reeds or up the creek. In one case, there was a pursuit over about 30 kilometres, I think. And the other reason is that in a few cases, the exact location has been purposefully obscured to prevent desecration of the site. So some of the findings, I think if we go to the next slide. Okay. So there were around 426 known massacres across the country, in which at least 11,206 men, women and children were killed. Those are conservative estimates. If we think, if the historians estimate perhaps 20 to 30 people were killed, we will use the number 20. And this is over a period of 134 years. In that whole period of 134 years, there were only 29 years in which no known massacre occurred. There was a period of 74 years from 1823 to 1897 in which there's only 2 years where a massacre didn't occur that we know of. So that's massacres occurring consistently across that whole period. 51% of massacres in Australia involved agents of the state, by which we mean government employees or people acting on behalf of the government, such as police, government surveyors, and so on. The 1840s were the most intense decade of massacres, and much of this occurred in Victoria, where massacres occurred from 1834 to 1854. So if you look at this graph, you can see that, on the left is the total number of massacres, and on the right is the number of victims in massacres. The blue section is those occurring in Victoria. So you can see the 1840s, that's the tallest bar, and the largest area making up that bar is Victoria. In Victoria, there were 49 known massacres in which 1,045 people were killed. These are some of the statistics on the screen there. Though that doesn't include some that happened on the Murray, which would affect people of the Mallee Millewa, because they're just across the border in New South Wales. One of the massacres in Victoria was a massacre of colonists in which 8 colonists were killed. And out of these massacres in Victoria, 16%, or 8 of them, involved agents of the state, mainly the native police.
Let's just interrupt there for a second. So is that figure's lower than the national average?
Yep.
And it indicates that there was a high degree of action by non-state parties, obviously.
Yes, it does. And I think some of the events that happened in Victoria in around 1838 kind of changed the way massacres were carried out for the rest of the history. But I'll get to that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Explained by some circumstance.
It seems to be the general pattern of frontier expansion that the government, we were talking about the difference between squatting and what the government actually has under control, that the government will have the first area of settlement under control, such as Sydney, and beyond that they declared the limits of location. And then in Victoria, the first areas of settlement, such as like around Melbourne, came under government control in the sense that they had police there who could monitor what people were doing, and determine who owned which parcel of land and that sort of thing. And then it's very hard to pinpoint where the frontier is and when it was in Australia, because it's so much happens in such a spread out way, and often it's roads and waterholes that are important. It's not like they just decide to enclose an area and that's suddenly within the frontier. The frontier isn't a very sharp line. It's more like a broad area. And the way I would define that broad area is between the first contact of Europeans, such as through exploration, and the time at which government gains control. And between that time, it's the frontier with squatting, Aboriginal resistance, and so on. So by the end of the 1850s, I suppose, you might say that the government had gained control of Victoria, in the sense that they could monitor and control who was where, who owned what piece of land. They could control Indigenous insurgents. It doesn't mean that resistance stopped or that conflict stopped. It just means the government at least considered itself able to police it. Mm-hmm.
On that, what was the population drop between that time, do you think?
To be honest, I'm really not sure. Population estimates are quite controversial and they vary widely. I kind of leave that debate to other people, but it is part of the project I'm working on now on historical frontier violence at Melbourne University to revise population estimates for Australia. That's being done by Boyd, but we don't have the results of that yet.
The point I was getting to is that Commissioner North is one of the reasons why massacres reduced was because a lot of people were already dead by this time.
Well, yes, that's probably fair to say. Yeah,
dead.
Yeah. Many had been killed, and so what follows after that is that.
Just if I might interrupt for a second, are any of the other historians able to help on that?
Well, I think I gave evidence earlier that we think the population at 1835 was 10, possibly 15,000, but we certainly know, because the government was able to count the population by the 1850s, that it was under 2,000. And I guess the general answer to the question that Commissioner North asked was, the settlers might say the country was settled down. And I think that's what you were saying, that there's government control, resistance has been squashed, and settler violence has also been squashed. Would that be a good way of putting it? The country was settled down.
Oh.
Maybe not the right word.
It was settled down.
But I might just add, Commissioner Walter, that there is evidence that we hopefully will come to from the 1857-1858 Legislative Council Select Committee inquiry, which has reference to the figures that Professor Broome has just mentioned of approximately 2,000. That was the estimate at that time. So we have a reasonable estimate. And if you might continue, please, Pascal.
And also the movements of Aboriginal people could be controlled. They could be moved forcibly to regions and so on. Yes. Okay, so the next slide, please. Sorry, this is just a list of the 8 massacres in Victoria that involved people acting on behalf of the government, 1 by the mounted police, 6 by the native police, and 1 by a government surveyor. So the next slide.
Can I just another one? It's sort of, I guess often when they talk about frontier violence, there is the idea that somehow it was both sides were violent.
Mm-hmm.
But by this reckoning here, and we know that any massacres of colonists would most definitely be known, 98% of the victims of massacres in Victoria were First Peoples.
I didn't calculate that statistic, but it makes sense.
39 and 1. So
exactly, yeah, it's very, very disproportionate. Yeah.
And before we look at the slide, Dr. Pascoe, there's the first event is said to have been carried out by the mounted police as opposed to the next 6, which are said to be native police. Is there a distinction intended by that reference?
Yes, I'm just wondering if perhaps I get to that later. Oh, no, all right, we'll talk about it now. So, yeah, the role of the police in this is quite important. The police force in New South Wales, Victoria was part of New South Wales, the colony of New South Wales at the time, was established, I think it was the 1820s. And at the time, there were 2 models for the police to be based on. One was the London Bobbies, who were working with a friendly civilian population, and their role is to protect the civilians from incidents of crime in an urban context. The other model for the police was the Irish Mounted Police, and their role was to suppress a hostile population that was largely rural. So in Australia, the main concerns of the government, or the main risks that they saw at the time, were convict insurrection, bushranging, and both of those involved Irish politics, and Indigenous insurgents. And obviously, it's not an urban population. So clearly, the model they were following was the mounted Irish Mounted Police, designed to suppress. So there's that to bear in mind. Now, when the Faithful Massacre, that's the massacre of colonists, happened, there was that was part of a kind of mass insurrection across the whole of Southeast Australia of Indigenous people. And colonists described it at the time, and thanks to Ray Kirkhope for pointing a certain article out to me about this. There's a colonist trying to put down for the country's history a record of the fact that there was an Indigenous insurgence at this time. And the Faithful Massacre was one of the incidents that sparked a response from the government. Squatters petitioned the government to step in and do something to protect them because they were British subjects, and threatened that if the government wouldn't do something, they would form a militia, basically, and take matters into their own hands. If the government wouldn't declare war, then they would do it themselves. At the time, as was discussed earlier, the government in Britain was a reformist government, committed to humanitarian causes like ending slavery and so on. So the British government told Gipps that he was not allowed to declare war on Aboriginal people because they were British subjects, according to the British. And that instead he should police the violence and stop Aboriginal people and settlers from killing each other. Those were the instructions from the British government. So Gipps found himself in a difficult situation with squatters and the harsh realities of the Australian frontier on the one hand, and commands issued from the other side of the world that didn't really appreciate what was happening here. So his solution to this was to increase the police force and establish more police bases on the overland route between Sydney and Port Phillip. And those police were recruited direct from active military or retired military. So this is a kind of beginning as well of another aspect of the Code of Silence, where they're called police, but in fact they're military personnel in this first instance. And their role is to protect people on the frontier, basically beyond the limits of settlement.
No, just to interrupt there. You say to protect people. Is it correct to say that it protects some people rather than people generally?
Well, yeah, I'll go back to a sort of a point I should have made earlier, which is in Australian history, you should always bear in mind the difference between de jure and de facto, which I'm sure you understand. But that's basically the difference between what is written down or declared, for example, by the government, and what is in fact reality, what is the true case of what's happening. And the obvious example is from the very beginning is Britain declared Australia to be governed by Britain, the whole continent, but in fact there was only a tiny amount of people in Sydney. So they're not really governing the whole of Australia. And that's important for the limits of location and so on. In reality, they're not governing anywhere beyond the limits of location. So similarly with the police, on paper, they exist to protect everybody from violence. But in reality, what happens is that they massacre Aboriginal people. And
so sorry for interrupting. Are there any, this may sound like a strange question, but are there any recorded instances of the police massacring non-Aboriginal people?
The Eureka Stockade, I think. I don't know how many people died in the Eureka Stockade. You don't have to know.
Not too many.
Yeah, okay. So that may be a rare, exceptional case, but also related to the Britain's fear of political insurrection. Again, that's a colonial issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Are we able to move on?
Yep. Okay, so yeah, so there's that difference. So it seems to me that what Gibbs's solution to this dilemma was to establish a de jure police force and a de facto military force. And I think the motivation behind this was to control violence. Now, at the same time, the British were afraid of another American Revolution. They did not want the squatters to organize and arm themselves as a military force. So I think what was happening is that under the Gibbs government, the government was taking control of the killing. They're saying, don't let the squatters kill people. We will be the ones doing the killing. And so these massacres occur. And there's plenty of letters and newspaper articles of squatters complaining that the government is doing nothing. Please send the native police. And the native police had a reputation for resolving the situation once and for all.
By that you mean by how would they resolve it?
Killing people.
Are we able to, is there anything else on this page that you wish to draw the Commissioner's attention to?
We've discussed the limits of location. That was Governor Gibbs' dilemma. There is a textbook called Small Wars. Now, the translation of guerrilla means small war. That's where the word guerrilla comes from wars in Spain. And it's the frontier wars in Australia are often referred to as guerrilla wars. They were carried out in a guerrilla style by both sides. Now, there's a book called Small Wars by Caldwell, published in 1896, which is sometime after this, but it was based on Britain's colonial experience for the previous 100 years throughout the 1800s. Now, if you're familiar with the massacres, there's almost every page rings true, even though he never mentions Australia. All the strategies that they have there sound like what happened in Australia. And in particular, one of the strategies there is to purposefully attack villages and to kill women and children in order to provoke the fighting men who normally have the advantage of stealth and hiding in the country that they know well into an open confrontation in which they commit all their men and so that they can all be killed in that confrontation, and the resistance and insurrection ended. So not specifically about Australia, but the tactics and strategies described there sound very familiar. And in terms of one more point in terms of government culpability, again, perhaps you should not just look at what government policy was and that sort of thing, but vested interests of people in Parliament or in the colonial government, whether they had private ownership or were profiting also from squatting or any of this killing happening on lands that they might have owned, or they may have been shareholders in companies. And the example I'm thinking of, which is not Victoria but New South Wales, is the Australian Agricultural Company, which is a company that still exists today, where parliamentarians in Britain granted massive amounts of land in New South Wales to the Australian Agricultural Company, whilst also being themselves shareholders in that company.
Yeah. Are there more slides?
Yes. So the next slide. Yeah. How are we with the time?
If we can just briefly cover this, I'd be grateful.
Move quickly. Yep. Okay. I just thought I'd point out a few things that kind of escalate to war in a typical frontier encounter. There's obviously the occupation and exploitation of resources, the destruction of lands and waters that people depend on for food. Sexual violence is a common story. Violation of sacred sites, and we already discussed the draconian British laws. When settlers said, do something or we will have to take the law into our own hands, the law in Britain in the early 1800s said that, the punishment for stock theft, which was a common resistance strategy, was death. So what they meant by taking the law into their own hands was to kill people. So the next slide. Various forms of Indigenous resistance, economic warfare. They knew that the reason settlers were there was because of their sheep and other livestock, so they regularly attacked those, stealing 1,000 at a time, sometimes. Targeted killings of particular individuals who'd broken their laws or were causing too much trouble. Strategic use of lands and waters, which you would have heard about in Budge Bin. Some of their hideouts, I guess, were in very rocky countries because they knew horses couldn't go there. They were coordinating strategic actions across great distances. They had spies employed by colonists, and they had various tactical advantages like knowing the country and how to get food and so on. So next slide. This is just focusing in on what happened in Victoria. Pattern of warfare in Victoria starts with the Convincing Ground Massacre in near Port Fairy in Gunditjmara country. But mainly there is the way it progresses is on the overland route from Sydney to Melbourne, going through Yoorrook, Tarongerong and Wurundjeri Kulin Nation country. And that's where the Faithful Massacre occurred. Then it progresses to the west with the Yumaralla Wars, and following that, the Gippsland Wars and the Murray River. So next slide. I've already discussed that, so we can go to the next slide. Okay, this is just to point out that people could coordinate resistance across very large areas. These are some of the main journeyways, strong lines or trade routes in traditional society in the southeast of Australia. So the point is that at that time in the 1840s, the insurgence was happening all at once from just north of Brisbane, all the way down to Gunditj Murray country. And that indicates that, I mean, they weren't, coordinating specific actions probably across that vast area, but it's certainly quite possible that people would have known that this was the time that everyone was to rise up. Next slide. We don't really have time for this, but this was just to go into some of the detail of specifically the South Road War, showing mounted police stations where Governor Gibbs deployed those extra troops, so on. But perhaps we can move on, and maybe we can come back later if people want to know specifically. Sorry, I've already talked about that. My slides might be out of order. Okay, so just to wrap it up, the legacy of violence on our current project, Yuman Elder Judy Atkinson points out that intergenerational trauma often doesn't fade away with time, but gets worse with each generation, especially considering what happens after the massacres and all of the things that have happened between then and now. Each generation has a new form of violence against it, and they develop new forms of resistance to it. After the massacres, women are abducted, children, workers as domestics and on farms, people get sent to missions. There's the eugenics phase. There's dog licenses and segregation, and all of the other things that you've been hearing about and will hear about. So the point is that it's still with us. And speaking with one elder who I won't name at the moment, but this elder has seen his friend killed, shot, and he's been a witness to deaths in custody inquiries. And for him, these massacres are still happening in that form. And he won't visit any massacre sites because it's too much for him. And he says to look inside what happened, not only that it happened, but what happened during the massacre. These massacres are not, well, massacres themselves are inhuman, but it's not just the massacre, it's the way that it's done that's beyond inhumanity, is what he says. And some of the things I've encountered in this research are the worst things I've ever heard of anyone ever doing to anyone in human history.
Thank you, Dr. Pesco.
Okay, thanks.
Is there anything that were you going to say something?
No, that's all. That'll do.
Thank you. Now, I just wanted to ask you some questions. Firstly, earlier we discussed in brief form, but the well-known massacres and events that occurred in Tasmania or Van Diemen's Land in the early 1800s and the rapid population decline there, and also the characterisation of the action in Tasmania as what are now understood to be acts of genocide. Are there any circumstances which have occurred in Victoria which are, in your view, in your individual views, similar in nature to what occurred in Tasmania? Anybody?
This culture of forgetfulness and the silence that Stannis spoke about, which is quite big in anthropology, where we feel more comfortable to forget. I think that's the same all over Australia, but I think the persecution of children in Tasmania and in Victoria, the murder of children, that's not known enough. We talk about massacre sites as if, they were children in there too, as well as adults. But the horror that the children had to endure, that's the worst thing for parents. And we talk about trauma. That kind of stuff is traumatic to listen to, what they did to the children. And I was, this warfare that you're talking about, I didn't hear anyone talk about poisoning the water holes where our people had to drink and hide. We needed water. So poisoning the water holes is very big in the history books for our people. And no doubt it was everywhere around Australia. But in terms of Tasmania, the biggest, when I grew up, I always heard about Truganini. But if you go to school, she was the last Tasmanian. And that silence that Stana talked about is you can connect to what was going on in terms of the history of Tasmania. Now, I was not long there in Tasmania, and I visited the convict women's prison. And there was a young girl all dressed up as a convict. And I said, but what about the Black Line? And she says, oh, we don't know if that actually happened. So here we have this disregard for history in Tasmania. And it's the tourism of Tasmania is a culture of forgetfulness, and it doesn't include Tasmania. So the true Tasmanian history. I went to South Australia a couple of years ago, and they're proud because they got no convicts. There's no history of convicts over there. So, this convict line that seems to be going all around the southeast coast of Australia has caused so much problem for Aboriginal people. We're not the problems, they are the problem. So, but it's when they start to own up to what their ancestors have done to our people, that's when we'll get true justice. But if we look at what's going on in Tasmania, there's so many massacre sites there. It's, and what they did to the young children there, turning the men, adopting them for goodness knows what. It is horror as well. And I tip my hat off to you, commissioners and chair, because you have to sit through all this, and it's our people, and it comes back to us acknowledging our family and our ancestors and what's happened to them. And we are an honourable race of people. We have gone through so much trauma and suffering, and we're still respectful to people, and we're still welcoming other cultures that are coming with trauma. We're doing all that, and yet we're also trying to get people to acknowledge the trauma that our ancestors and those that have come and walked, that we're walking in their footsteps. We're trying to honour that. So I really do appreciate the work that you're doing for all of our people.
Thank you. You want to say something?
Yeah, look, I guess I've got 4 things to say about the situation between Tasmania and Victoria, and it revolves around the word genocide. I think we haven't really talked about the Aboriginal Protectorate, but its purpose was to change and to control as well as protect. So I think there's no doubt that cultural genocide existed in Victoria. And I said as much in a book in 1982. As for government, I think there was no intention to commit genocide, but the nature of the frontier, as Bill has talked, has meant that government became implicated in some of those events from the military police and also the creation of the native police, which was supposed to be a civilising force, but also it took advantage of intergroup enmities that were played out on the frontier because Aboriginal people only were friendly with close groups in proximity, and distant groups were aliens like the white fellas. So the government, because of the pressures on the frontier, gets involved in actions that are unlawful. And so I think one way of thinking about it, a colleague of mine, Tony Barter, once talked about relations of genocide, which shows that over time things get out of control and out of hand, and it's really about colonisation. The relations of genocide are about what happens in colonisation. You've got two people struggling over the one piece of land. You've got two people with different understandings of the world and each other, and inevitably that leads to what the outcome was, in my view. But I don't know whether...
Professor Broom, it is very predictable then. So the tension mightn't be there, but the predictability is that will happen.
Yeah, it's not inevitable because nothing is ever inevitable in human affairs or history, but all the dots started to fall in line. Colonisation inevitably leads to situations like this. Not all the time, but in many cases. But I don't know.
I might just follow up on Commissioner Walter's question, Professor Broom. It is the case that the New South Wales government, or the Lieutenant Governor for the Port Phillip colony, understood that with the expansion of the pastoralism, there would be deaths at the hands of the squatters. You accept that they would have understood that.
Yes, and the governor warned the squatters about this, but by letting colonisation proceed, it was inevitably going to happen. Deaths would happen.
You wanted to say something?
I've got a slightly different view on genocide to Richard. I think that the tool that Raphael Lemkin gave us is a really useful one. Words matter. And I think that if you look at the 5 clauses, you can absolutely see all of those things happening in Tasmania and in Victoria. I think that getting caught up in the issue of intention is a tricky road to go down. Right now we are thinking about the concept of the bystander. What does it mean for us to stand by when we know terrible things are happening in the world? There would have been many bystanders at this time, knowing what was going on, understanding the atmospheric violence, as to quote Tracy Bannabanua, a historian also from La Trobe, that would have been, I guess, the vibe of Victoria, or what was to become Victoria. So I think that if we get caught up in intention, we need to think about the bystanders too. I think we need to think about the fact that the colonial government in New South Wales would have known and perhaps even assumed that settlers would undertake this violence and that it would help them control the Indigenous population.
Thank you. I might just ask the operator to put document 2 back on the screen. Dr. Pascoe, you appear to want to add something?
Yes, that's right. There's just a few points. If you look at the Warrigal Creek massacres, that's a collection of massacres where a group of colonists got together and called themselves the Highland Brigade. They weren't actually the Highland Brigade. but that name indicates that they saw themselves as being a war party on behalf of the empire. That's sort of their mindset. And they went around from campsite to campsite, massacring anyone that they could find. Their intention was to wipe out everyone, which is an act of genocide. And it seems to be that in the colony at the time, there were two sides or more to settlers' politics. But the prevailing and dominant side seems to have been the one in favour of violent imperial conquest. And squatters saw themselves as playing their part in that. And, some squatters had skulls mounted above their door as trophies. And so, yeah, there's a general attitude in the colony. Some of them, the more extreme, but not an uncommon view, was that everyone should be exterminated.
I'll ask you this question, Dr. Pascoe. Were the activities of the Highland Brigade known to the government? No, can you answer that?
I'm not sure, but I see. I think it would have been hard for them not to have been known. I don't know about before the fact, but certainly after the fact.
And were any of the so-called Highland Brigade ever charged with any offences brought before the?
I don't know about the Highland Brigade, but it's in some cases there's only one case of colonists being found guilty and punished for their crimes, and that was the Mile Creek Massacre. It's quite famous because of it. They were convicts, which matched the British people's view that convicts were responsible for the low levels of morality in the colony. They were the only ones found guilty and punished, and they were hung. That contributed to the code of silence in that colonists forever after thought that if anyone found out, they might themselves be hung, but that never happened. Some people were sometimes brought to court, but they always got off.
But they were the only ones, the convicts were found sort of guilty of a massacre. Is that in all those massacres that you've mapped? That it's a
out of all of those 426 massacres, that's the only one that ever resulted in a conviction of colonists.
Can I just ask a question if anyone on the panel is aware of the Neil Black statement about taking land where somebody's already committed murders?
Yes, I'm aware of that, Commissioner. And I think Neil Black is expressing the relief that he didn't have to be involved in any sort of violence to clear his run. And so that shows, again, the spectrum. There were some people that maybe wouldn't have done it, but were happy that someone else had.
At the same time, he acknowledged that there were others who had no qualms about doing those killings.
That's correct. That's correct. And another man, Henry Mayrick, was also quite forthcoming, and I think also George Robinson in Western District were quite forthcoming about the hard men who would push on to action.
Could we put document 7 on the screen, please? I just want to take you to what is an extract from the 1837 report from the United Kingdom Select Committee, United Kingdom Parliament Select Committee on Aboriginal Tribes. And we want page 13, please. And if you can, yes. So in this paragraph from the report, I'll read it to you. It says, "It is true that to remain passive under actual outrages would encourage savages in their perpetration, but we regret that in any instance punishment which appears disproportionate should have been inflicted. We find that the natives on the Murray River mentioned as amongst the most troublesome in this quarter, and in the summer of 1834 they murdered a British soldier, having in the course of the previous 5 years killed 3 other persons. In the month of October 1834, Sir James Stirling, the governor, proceeded with a party of horse to the Murray River in search of the tribe in question. On coming up with them, it appears that the British horse charged this tribe without any parley and killed 15 of them, not, as it seems, confining their vengeance to their actual murderers. After the rout, the women who had been taken prisoners were dismissed, having been informed that in inverted commas, the punishment had been inflicted because of the misconduct of the tribe, that the white man never forget to punish murder, that on this occasion the women and children had been spared, but if any other person should be killed by them, no one would be allowed to remain on this side of the mountains. Now, that is clearly the dispensation of arbitrary justice and execution of people without trial, and is consistent with an absence of law and order in the way in which the colony operated. And this was carried out by the governor of the day. Would you agree with me that if it's known that the governor of the day is acting in this way, that it would be open slather for any other members of the colony to also act in that way?
Right.
As we're getting to the very truth of this, that I think was in Western Australia. Notice the date was 1834. Victoria was not settled by the Hentys till 34 and Melbourne 35. But it actually, it could be representative of some government officials, because Bill talked about the number of actions that were taken by military forces or by the police forces. But I had to correct that.
Yes.
It is a Western Australian. Governor Stirling was in the Western Australian.
Governor, that's correct.
It actually, while it's not about Victoria,
Yes,
it's pertaining in the sense that we know from the work done on the massacre map that there were actions taken by government forces. Now, whether the governor knew about them is another matter, but certainly police forces were either not properly briefed, trained, or directed not to take action.
So I just want to briefly deal with the time that we have left with the reference to the use of pejorative terms such as savages to describe Aboriginal people in a way that may have permitted this degree of inhumanity and brutality against the Aboriginal people. In your book, Professor Broom, you discussed the use of this term savages, and identify that there appeared to be 2 main bases for that. The use of that term, it was used to describe people on the basis that they engaged in cannibalism and in infanticide.
Well, of course, there are great rumours fluctuating in the colony. All groups have a view of another group that's not true. It's a stereotype. And so these were part of the fears, the anxieties, the moral outrage of settlers that they thought that Aboriginal people were like this. And of course, there was a whole range of other tropes about the savage, that they were unreliable, they were freckless, they were likely to change on the moment, and they were just stereotypes, but they did create fear in people's minds, create determination that these were aliens, they mightn't be able to be incorporated. And so I'm sure it plays out in the minds of people in the Highland Brigade or elsewhere that are riding against, in a bushwhacking situation, riding against a group of people that they think that they're not quite human.
Yep. You were looking to say something, Dr. Pascoe?
Yes, I think in the minds of people doing this sort of thing, if they want to do it or if they feel compelled to do it to protect their fortune or whatever it might be, it just helps them in their own mind to deal with the guilt of it if they keep telling themselves that they're not really people or that they're, bad people.
Sally House?
Add that, in this period, that certainly wasn't the only way in which people thought about First Nations people, that there are plenty of examples of absolute human contact, of relationships being built, of respect, of learning about the culture, particularly in the William Thomas papers. So I think both of those things existed at the same time, but that the idea of the quote unquote savage was a reason, it was a convenient mistruth that people wanted to believe at that time, and it was an available narrative to them.
I think a helpful way of thinking about it, Albert Memmi, who was a Tunisian who thought a lot about colonialism, said that in colonial situations there's a usurper complex, that if you take someone's possessions or land, you have to explain it to the world and to yourself. So the way you do it is to create a stereotype that you're a noble pioneer creating wealth from the land, and the original owners have never made anything of the place. They're possibly savages, and so this is a way of rationalising, as Bill Pascoe said, a way of rationalising what's going on. So they're using these racial ideas to confirm in their own minds what they're doing.
Yes.
To relieve what sometimes is referred to as perpetrator's guilt.
Yes, I would think so.
You're looking to say something?
Yeah, just from an anthropological point of view here, we're talking about culture. So, and the Darwin evolution theory, okay, of races around the world. And when all of this colonisation was occurring, they brought with that theory of evolution, and Aboriginal people were down the bottom. So this is where we started getting Melanesia, Micronesia, Polynesia, and then Aboriginal people were down the bottom. We didn't invent the wheel. That's the other thing that was also weighing against us, but also because we were developing and living on stone tools. Okay, so we weren't a society that had evolved. Okay, but we were actually living in a community where we weren't changing the environment. We weren't manipulating the environment. That came later after colonisation. But we lived in harmony, and we knew how to live on our country and not put our country under duress. But we were in competition with people like Polynesians, who are the warm, friendly, full of dancers and welcoming, smiling people. We were in competition with Micronesia. We were in competition with Melanesia. But, our knowledge of our country is now celebrated today. So this is where we weren't respected. And now this term savage and the noble savage and all that kind of stuff, that was actually, and hunter and gatherers, we were also branded as that as well. So, our knowledge today is celebrated and sought after so much today. That's the difference.
And in that vein, if I may say, a former Vice-Chancellor of Monash University, Sir Richard Eggleston, and I don't know if your family might have remembered Elizabeth Eggleston.
Yep.
He made a statement to the press that Aboriginal people walked so gently across this land, they never left a footprint. It says everything.
I'd ask that document 6 be placed on the screen. Now, that document is titled pastoral holdings, I think, of the Port Phillip district in Victoria from 1830s to 1851. And you can see on that map, which shows those holdings up until 1850, up to 1851, the intense occupation of the southwest, what might be called the Portland district, and the observation can be made that throughout central Victoria, excluding the Wimmera district and parts of the Gippsland district, there doesn't appear to be any land left whatsoever that hasn't been disposed of by 1851. And so I'm wondering whether there are observations that can be made about the prevalence and a number of parcels in the Portland district and the recorded massacres that existed in that area. Is there any observation that can be made about that?
Yeah, the massacres in that area, the Yoorrook Wars, one of the most dense clusters in the whole of Australia. And just generally speaking, the distribution of that map matches the distribution of massacres. Some down in the southwest in Gippsland, southeast in Gunai country, and high density in Portland. Ones on the overland route up through what's called the Murray district on that map, and those few ones that are beside the Murray River up in the northwest, also massacres up there.
And I can tell you that on that map, if we were to zoom in the area above Portland, there are two properties, namely Merino Downs and Muntham, that are the properties of the Henty brothers. So it would appear that they eventually got their pastoral leases, and it's recorded. I asked you to accept from me that it's recorded that those pastoral leases that were issued up to that point were owned by some 246 men, and they owned all of those leases between them. So it demonstrates a centralisation of wealth within a relatively small group of people. We are very close to we perhaps exceeded our time today. However, it will come to the Commissioner's attention in examination of the report from the Victorian Legislative Council Select Committee on Indigenous people from 1857, that one of the members of the committee was a Mr. J. Henty. We heard in the properties that I spoke of are on the map that we can see on the screen, to the left and slightly below the letter P in Portland. If we might attempt to zoom in a little, but the description from Professor Broom of the Henty family earlier today as being a family who were finding it difficult breeding, raising sheep in rural England, leaving that place and coming to Australia and becoming part of what might be understood as the landed gentry, and then rising to the position of legislators in the Parliament. I suggest to you that just taking that family as an example, and I don't say that apart from their role in coming to Portland first, there's necessarily anything different about that family to the other family, but I suggest to you that it's possible to understand what has occurred in this way, that the Gunditj Mara people were wealthy in their own country and lands. They were wealthy and rich in their land and their waters and their culture. And at the point of the grant of their lands to the Henty brothers and others, that wealth was given to other people, to those people, and their wealth was then lost and hasn't been returned. Would you agree with that description or characterization of a transfer of wealth?
Would?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Now, today we haven't had the chance to speak about the role of the protectorate, the Aboriginal protectorate, nor have we had the chance to go into detail about the select committee's processes and findings. That matter, commissioners, will be covered tomorrow by the panel tomorrow, and
wanted to make in the context of that, we were going somewhere before about one of the Henty family members being on that committee.
The point, perhaps only the irony of it, Commissioner Lovett, that one of the people who was at the forefront of the dispossession and the transfer of wealth from Aboriginal people to the new owners then gets to sit on a committee that examines what's happened to these poor Aboriginal people and make recommendations about what happens next.
Bit of pattern for the history, didn't it?
And so the suggestion will be, commissioners, that occurred 246 times over at the expense of the Aboriginal people of this state, and there has been no accounting for that. I suggest to our witnesses that there has been no accounting for that to date, that transfer of wealth. Would anybody argue with that proposition?
No, I would not. No.
But I can extend it to Edward Kerr. So Edward Kerr's father was from Tasmania, and he was born there, and then he was educated in England, his wealthy family, and then he relocated to Victoria, and he became very, very prominent in the Yoorrook land. But I also noticed in those border protected, that he was on the board for Victoria, the Aboriginal Protection Board. So that's Edward Kerr.
So what can be noted about the Protectorate Board before we close for the afternoon is that the Protectorate Board was in operation in Victoria at the very time at which the massacres peaked. That's correct. So the massacre diagram that Dr. Pascoe showed us with the peak in the 1940s is the very period when the Aboriginal Protectorate was supposed to be ensuring that the protection of Aboriginal people and fulfilling their other function of keeping Aboriginal people out of Melbourne, but their main job was intended to be protecting Aboriginal people. And of course, we know from the statistics that the population declined at such a rapid rate, perhaps in a match of the rapid rise in wealth of the pastoralists, which the chair spoke of in her opening comments.
Perhaps another story that's relevant there is the way in which the colonial government really did not support that early protectorate, that those protectors were undermined at every moment by the colonial government and were unable to do the job of protecting for various reasons. But one of the reasons is that colonial government, they would withhold the rations that they were supposed to be giving. They would give them orders that they couldn't fulfill. They would move people around. So in a sense, those protectors, which were sent from Britain to do some protecting, were not able to do that job because of the people like Charles La Trobe.
And also the squatters and pastoralists absolutely hated them because the sale of land was paying for the cost of the protectorate. So they didn't agree with it, and they didn't agree with the way it was funded. So they undermined it massively as well, and were always on the governor's back that get rid of this mob. They're harbouring Aboriginal sheep stealers, etc. So it was undermined from many quarters.
In the two books that I took you to with relation to the Tasmanian situation, both those authors formed the view that there was a pretense of caring for Aboriginal people that never ever came to fruition. And the question that might properly arise on the basis of the evidence just given by Associate Professor Ellinghouse is whether, on the back of the recommendations that came out of the UK Parliamentary Select Committee in 1837 about the need for greater protection of Aboriginal people, that there's the potential, at least, that there's the process of creation of a protectorate for Aboriginal people was perhaps a pretense to allow the other activities that were going on in terms of the wholesale dispossession of land to occur unabated.
I would agree with that.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. Our witnesses have all stayed on longer than they were asked to, and made other arrangements. The matters which are left to deal with in this early period are all available to be dealt with on the documents, Commissioners, and unless there are specific questions from the witnesses, I don't propose to ask them any other questions at this point.
All day, very thoughtful, and I think that's enough for today. Thank you.
In that case, Commissioner, I would ask that the witnesses be released, and if we might adjourn to resume tomorrow.
Thank the witnesses for a hard topic, for leaning in and being honest and open, and knowing that you have a majority of Aboriginal people that you're telling it to, and in the room and online. So thank you for your honesty, and thank you for just saying it as it needs to be said. Thank you.
I'd like to add to that. I didn't want to say I believe the protectorate was a failed experience. That first 10 years never was fulfilled. And halfway through that, that's when the rot set in here. And I didn't really want to say that, but I think it's part of the story. But thank you very much for your
thank you, Chair.
Also as well, mob listening in as well. We do have a social and emotional wellbeing team here, so please do reach out to us if you do, particularly given today's evidence as well. Deeply traumatic subjects that we're talking about here. We're dealing with our ancestors and their lives and country as well. So I just want to just make sure that sentiment is expressed to our people as well, and further to our panel members here today. Thank you very much for your time as well. Yeah.
We'll adjourn until tomorrow morning. Thank you.